Hello again. So here we go for the last hour in the end of the day of the course, and the second part as well of this course of this session on social innovation and social policy and social planning. I wanted to present you the research project, so it will be really the research design, but as well the research results as much as possible of a research project that I had the opportunity to coordinate a few years ago with German and Swiss colleagues. The first financing came by the French Health Ministry, and then we have matching funds by a Swiss private foundation, the most important YB Lennart's Foundation in Geneva. And the research project or the research program was about how can we learn from foreign countries, so from French and from Swiss perspective, how can we learn from foreign experiments, foreign social innovations in the domain of long-term care for the aged. So it was really the idea for research teams to bring in really expertise and experiments and knowledge about foreign experiments, so that maybe it was very much in this perspective of learning from foreign countries. This is really this perspective of best practices, policy learning and best practices. So what we did with the German and the Swiss colleagues was to develop a research design in which we had a rather complex, but in the end of the day, it's rather multi-dimensional definition of social innovation. And I think only this definition of this proposal might be an interesting input for us to reflect about, again, from another perspective on what is social innovation. And what we did is a threefold definition. The first point that you have here was to define quite concretely social innovation in the context of the existing national long-term care system. So the first phase of the research really was to characterize, was to describe the long-term care systems of the three countries that we had picked for the comparative research, and in order to bring interesting case studies and social innovations in this domain of long-term care for the aged. And I said it, we had Germany, Scotland and Switzerland. So we did this institutional and actor-centered analysis. What are, if we consider the challenges, the important points of in this domain of long-term care, we had issue about quality, about governance, about what is the appropriate scale and rescaling of the system, and as well in terms of democracy and in terms of participation, the ability of the concerned person to do choices and to participate in the way they receive care and they might choose care forms in the context of the long-term care systems they have to deal with. So you see the three criteria from which we would characterize the national systems, and from that we would say and identify specific shortcomings of each system, the German one, the Scottish one and the Swiss one. And we would say, so we have identified a specific weakness or specific shortcomings in terms of quality management, for instance, in the German system. So we would be interested in looking for specific innovations at local level that would address specifically these shortcoming in terms, for instance, of quality management or in terms of participation. Okay, so this was a rather pragmatic, I think, way of defining and of handling social innovation, to relate it to the national context, characteristics, patterns assessed in terms of advantages, but of course focusing on the shortcomings. Second point, we were interested in considering social innovations as they are inspired by clear policy discourses. Maybe you noticed that in what the way I try to structure the course, or the notions or the points that are important for me. And I think the idea of policy ideas, political models, values, and this kind of things matter for me. So I wanted to have that dimension as well, to say we had that already at the beginning of the course. We had the idea that social innovation was first of all influenced by the new public management kind of setting and organizational, market related, and on the other hand that we had this other tradition, more solidaristic, more social economy kind of conception of social innovation. So I said, we have these cleavages, we should take them seriously and try to see if we can identify where those social innovations we are going to look at, where do they come from, okay? So it was the second dimension. And then the third dimension was to look at the trajectory of social innovation. Because in the end of the day, we said, it's nice to have a social innovation. So it implies, as we said in the definition of social innovation, not only that we have a new social need that is addressed, but as well that we have an actor or a system of actor that has been able to learn and to develop and to change its own ways, its own management, or its own cooperation, or its own relation, networks, etc. Bringing new cooperation, inviting new competencies, etc. Various forms of transformation, but let's say transformation in the way we produce the services, okay? So we have both dimensions, new products and new ways of producing those services. So this is an interesting notion, and this is an interesting point of starting point, if you want. But there's more, because we need to understand what is the trajectory on the medium or long term of the social innovation. Is the how does the social innovation get institutionalized via a policy scheme, a policy instrument? How does it work? Is the social innovation kept the way it was developed, the way it was thought of, as it circulates along the policy cycle? You remember what we said about the policy cycle: problem formulation, decision making, but then we have the idea that a policy instrument is transformed already at the stage, during the step of its transformation into a policy instrument, into policy tools. This is an important dimension, of course. And then you remember as well how many obstacles can hinder, can transform the institutionalization at the stage of implementation, can transform the initial intentions of any form of policy making, of any type of policy action. So if it's a social innovation, then we have very specific content, we have very specific needs that have been identified and that we want to address. So if at the level of institutionalization things get lost, then of course this is a problem. And then we have the idea, the third step would be here, you see, development, generalization, sustainability. Very often social innovations are developed by small groups of actors or by one association, but then the issue of its steadiness, of its maintenance, of its capacity, either to be sustainable, so to be durable at some point, or to be generalized, because it might in some context appear very unfair to keep a social innovation which address specific needs in just one city, for instance. If we take the scale of a region like Lombardy why would the region of Lombardy finance a specific policy scheme that would address specific needs only in Milan or in Lodi or in Monza, and not generalize and not make this new service available for the rest of the region. So it poses issues in terms of equality of treatment of the population at some point. So we have to think not only of the institutionalization, yes, and of the development of a social innovation, not only in the time perspective, but as well in the space perspective, if you want, in the territorial dimension. That might maybe one innovation should be applied and developed at the level of an entire and complete territory. So those were our three dimensions to focus on, the ways we wanted to develop innovation, social innovation, and we wanted first of all to look for an interesting social innovation, then to interpret those social innovation, and then to look at the way they were developed, institutionalized, and eventually generalized or kept alive through time at some point. Okay, well, this is the local cases that we have picked. I don't want to mention them all because there are too many of them, of course, so I wouldn't have time. But maybe I would just quote a few of those. So maybe there are two that we are going to look into in more detail just after, because I would like you to have an impression of the content and then the analytical grid that we have here. So that I apply with you this analytical grid that we have here in the case of the German Care Conference in the city of Hamburg, and in Geneva, community lunch. This is both cases that we are going to look into. But for instance, I would give another example of dementia care for the Turkish community. In the city of Aalen, which is in the western part of Germany, in North Rhine-Westphalia, this is an industrial city, and they have a very strong Turkish community. People who came in the 60s, 70s, and who now have grown old and are now facing diseases such as dementia, so Alzheimer and other forms of dementia. And they have realized in this city of Aalen that the Turkish community doesn't use much of the specific services that have been developed in order to fight or to support the population facing dementia. So they did an analysis of what were the causes, why wouldn't the people from the Turkish community apply to the dementia care, to the service, specific information, specific care management that they would provide at the level of the city or the region, etc. So it has been an analysis, but as well an attempt to replicate or to foster the network of care, cure, counsel in the context of the Turkish community, because they realized that were like size to size care and cure networks and not really integrated public spaces, because the first generation of the Turkish migrant, very often they are still uneasy with the German language, and they are still reading only Turkish newspapers and watching Turkish TV and not really integrated in the German public sphere. So they don't know about the services that are made available to them by the long-term care network and services at the level of a city, for instance. Another example that I could quote, because this is another study that I did myself, and I prefer to be presenting the case studies that I did myself. It's a reablement service in Edinburgh. So, yeah, no, it's too early for me to say that, but a reablement service in Edinburgh. So it's the capital, really capital city of Scotland, and there they have developed a service that aimed at reabling the people who had so aged people who went to the hospital to get an operation, or because they fall at home or on the street, and so they went into a state of shock. And after this kind of accident, let's say, of this kind of disease, if it's the case that they had a disease, a stroke or something like that, then they normally want to go home and to live again at their own homes when they can. So the city of Edinburgh decided to put a lot of money in reabling these people, so providing them a lot of occupational therapy, providing specific massages, specific therapy as well, so that they could be able to be living autonomously, for instance, at their home, and so to invest a lot of money or of services, let's say, at the first stage, so that they then, after that, would require less care and less care services. So the idea was a rather managerial idea to reconstitute the autonomy of the person as quick as possible. Okay, so this is another example of social innovation that was interesting for us. And now I will get into the details, more into the details of two other case studies that I would like to go to analyze and to I would like to apply, as I said, the analytical grid to those two next case studies I would like to present now. Hello again. So maybe before I get really into the presentation of the two case studies I want to have a look with you, I would like to present you the political dimension of the innovation, social innovation in social services that we decided to shed some light on, and we decided to maybe have a rather modern look of the inspiration of the values that inspire social innovation. And we have two dimensions that we decided to pick. The first dimension is about the, it's inspired very much by the neoliberal critique that we had already. So this idea that we have new public management, economic governance, or preferably market forms of governance. So this is really the kind of innovation that is inspired by a neoliberal critique. So we had it already, but for the whereas we had, you know, this inspiration by social economy, so rather this third sector associative kind of ideas. Here we picked what we called here a libertarian critique. So it's rather a second left, if you want, a new left kind of criticism. So a kind of discourse, policy discourse about the welfare state or about democracy, which is very much inspired by governance without government, for instance, very light governance, the idea that we can keep things away from institutions, the idea that networks and policy networks are really important. So this would be, for instance, an illustration of what this libertarian critique is, centered on the individual, centered on sexual minorities, centered on the gender perspective, so feminist perspective, for instance, over the welfare state. Service provision, if we look at that, then we would have a privileged service provision that would tackle the idea that there must be diversity. For instance, for the first one, innovation inspired by libertarian critique, service provision, diversity is important in order to correct the general setting, the too paternalist form of welfare provision by the state that we had in the previous system. So if we go then to the line neoliberal critique, we have as well plurality, but it's another dimension of plurality that we have to deal with here. It's not a plurality that is sensitive to political diversity in terms of minorities in the first line, in the first dimension, and so inspiration by libertarian critique. This is very much diversity in terms of gender, in terms of cultural origins, in terms of migration, in terms of religion. So this is this type of, let's say, cultural, if you want, the diversity. But if we look at the innovation that would be inspired by neoliberal critique, then it's rather market diversity. So we would have the idea that we want to cut with the standard provision in both dimensions. We want to cut with the standard provision of services as it comes from the regular public, let's say, or state-centered kind of social services. So this really the idea here, that we have to deal with discourses that would both inform social innovations, but that would as well so inform social innovations, that would as well develop a critical point of view as of the welfare state as it had developed so far. Okay, so it's the idea that both those discourse, libertarian critique and neoliberal critique, are inspired by a critical point of view over the welfare state as it has developed until now, let's say. Okay. Last example, which is in my view very telling, if you want, if we look for social services that would increase the participation of the end users, for instance, of the beneficiaries and of their family, caregivers, and related, closely related people, people with disability or people in old age. So if we say we focus on this dimension of participation, okay? So then the critique, as it's formulated in terms of libertarian critique, would focus on the dimension of democratic participation. So we want associations, we want the individuals, we want a variety of values and of interests, but most of all values, to be integrated into various decision process in the steering of long-term care, but as well as individual level, that there are possibilities of implications of the individuals. On the other hand, if we focus or if we try to think in terms of neoliberal critique, then the basic idea is to raise participation as well. Yes, it's true, but from a setting which is a market setting. And then the way, in the context of a market setting, to reinforce the participation of the individuals is to create them or to grant them and to recognize them a market power. So people, if you see here the column participation, the people are considered as consumers. They are considered as clients, and they have as such. There is as such a regulation, a participative, um, participative and kind of dimension of democracy here, in terms of participation or control, at least, of the by the individuals of the long-term care provision. Okay, so we have those various dimensions, and I think this was the way for us to conceive, to begin with, social innovation in political terms. Okay. Then, just to quote the two examples that we had developed. The first one is taken place in the case of Geneva. It was based on scientific knowledge, which was put to the public, that said that in the end of the day, for frail elderly, very often those people, frail elderly, very old people or elderly people living at home, in various occasions, in many occasions, there are isolated people. And those isolated people, they cannot cook for themselves, and as they live on their own, there's nobody that can cook for them on a regular basis. So the provision that we know very well on various countries, in various cities of Europe, is Meals on Wheels. So it's the delivery, the house delivery of meals. Okay, but the recent studies show that it's more important for the health and for the mental health and for the dynamism, for the self-esteem, for the welfare of these people, the well-being of these people, to be having lunch or to be having their meals in not in public but in a community, to not to be on their own all the time. So the social innovation in Geneva was to, instead of bringing the meals at home to these people, to taking the people out of their homes and to organize meals in small restaurants in the neighborhood, so that these people are not alone and can share their meals with social workers, but as well with the neighbors or with isolated people living in the same neighborhood. Okay, so this was this idea of a community lunch in the case of Geneva, the idea to promote social inclusion and health. And we said, and we classify here, because we were interested in both dimensions, governance, service provision, quality, and participation. We thought it belongs clearly to participation, because people, of course, can take up this service, this offer, or they can not take it up. They can say, we prefer to stay at home. So they have the power to choose, but it's an increased quality, of course, of the service to provide not only food, but as well a context which is motivating, which is stimulating for the people. Okay. The second case study and the second social innovation was this Pflegekonferenzen in Hamburg. Oh, here there's a mistake. It's not Hamburg, it's Hamburg. So this has to be understood in the context really of the transformation of long-term care policies in Germany, with the idea of, from the mid-90s, to introduce a market supply of the services and of the long-term services. So in the case of Germany, the social democratic, the SPD Länder, so the regions which are run by SPD, resisted a lot because of their socialist, let's say, mindset. They resisted a lot the introduction of those market regulations. So they decided to organize as much as possible, but was particularly true with care conferences and Pflegekonferenzen. Those are care conferences where they would invite big meetings in which they would invite all stakeholders of long-term care at city level or at the level of a neighborhood, of a district of this big city of Hamburg, more or less 2 million inhabitants. So they had divided the city in districts, and there are like 8 or 9 districts, if I remember it properly. And the district of Eimsbüttel here is a district of, let's say, 250,000 inhabitants, and they would invite all the stakeholders, all the suppliers, all the providers, the general practitioners, so the doctors, the nurses, the daycare center, and all associations or people that would be concerned to create a democratic space that would try to balance the bad in the eyes of this social democratic municipality or land government. They would try to balance the bad influence of the market by creating a democratic space. Okay, so the idea was here to have a participatory organization at local and even infra-local level, the level of a neighborhood. Though 250,000 inhabitants, this is of course a big issue, this is a big thing, this is not a small scale stuff. But anyway, so to create this participatory assembly or space, so that people could together decide or deliberate about the priorities of a care policy, of a long-term care policy for the aged people in not only the city of Hamburg, but in the neighborhood of Eimsbüttel. For instance, but there is not, of course, not only Eimsbüttel, but all districts of Hamburg have their own care conference. Okay, so those are the 2 experiments that we looked at. There were 9, so it's just the one that I just picked now to present and to provide the analysis so that we can maybe better understand how social innovation works. So for both innovations that I've picked now, I think both innovations were inspired by the social, so by the libertarian, let's say, paradigm of innovation. So it's really the idea of fostering social integration. In the case of Hamburg, this was clearly inspired, but I cannot get into that by this concept of soziale Stadt. So this is really this social city. This is a very old instrument of regulation of social policy in Germany, in the social democratic tradition of Germany, as well centered on the notion of democracy and participation. But I think this is very clear from the instrument itself. Okay, so maybe this is enough about the political dimension. I think this is rather clear. If we look at the first step of now, if we look and if we move on to the last step of the analysis that I wanted to provide here, it was really this idea that we not only look at the innovation in itself and the policy discourse that has inspired it, but that we look as well at the way it has been transformed into an institution, so into a policy, regular policy, so an instrument that has been financed and was in the end of the day implemented by social workers, etc. And then how it was, on the long term, how it was sustainable. So the first point of institutionalization, well, in the case of Geneva, it was a kind of convention, so an agreement, if you want, between the city and the regional social work organization, so a rather simple form of institutionalization. In the case of Hamburg, it was institutionalized by law, so it's by a law at the level of the region, because in Germany the Länder, so the regions, are very autonomous on the constitutional level, so they decided to pass a law, and which integrated this notion of care conference. So it was a very official, let's say, or very well institutionalized policy instrument. But when we have looked at the way, then it has been implemented, because in both cases, you see, in the case of Geneva, this was an innovation from 2011. In the case of Hamburg, it had been introduced in the very beginning of the millennium in 2001. And when we looked at that in the mid-2010, so it was 2013-14 that we did the field research, those instruments had already have been implemented for several years. So we could see what were the concrete results in comparison to the initial intentions of the initiators, looking for more participation, for instance, or looking for an increased well-being of the people in the case of the community lunch. In the case of Geneva, the results were rather kind of disappointed as well, because the idea to really empower the community and to increase the well-being of the people were transformed rather in the idea that it was just another added mail service, so just another service, but not that this idea of sharing communitarian value and increase the well-being of the people was kind of lost, because the instrument had been kind of normalized, transformed into like a very common and banal, in the end of the day, service with no communitarian, I would say, character and sense of belonging of the people to a choice and to an instrument that would make a specific sense for them. In the case of the care conference in the neighborhood that I've looked in more detail into, I realized that in fact this participatory instrument, was in fact controlled by public health officers of the city. So it was the public health bureau organization of the city of Hamburg and the head of the public hospital that controlled the care conference. So the participatory dimension of that had been lost, because all that happened was rather that very general public health notions and messages were just circulated in this care conference that were not very successful in the end of the day. So this was this idea that that the bottom-up participation was rather weak, and it was rather top-down again, public health messages that were not inflicted, but that were really promoted in a rather traditional way, let's see. Okay, so in both cases, rather disappointing results in the end of the day, and as a kind of consequences of this this analysis, this rather disappointing analysis, we ended up with the idea that it's really important in the end of the day to consider not only the point of departure of a social innovation, but as well its ability, its capacity, its sustainability. So its capacity to get established really over time. Um, and I think that this is really something I would um, further like to look into, because I think that very often in most studies we have a big deal of information about how creative, how innovative, how interesting, how informed by scientific, medical, social, psychological knowledge. So this is of course very important, but there's very little work about this idea of sustainability. I would like, for instance, to insist on the case of Geneva, because maybe my presentation of it was a little bit too, too came a little too short. Um, I think the very big pitfall in the case of Geneva was precisely caused by the idea, but after a while, I think it worked very well for 1 or 2 years in the case of Geneva, at a level of a small of a neighborhood, a rather small neighborhood, in fact, of Geneva, a neighborhood called Carouge. So it worked rather well, as it was initiated by local social workers. But after a while, very often, and it was the case in the case of Geneva, social innovations can be developed from specific funding, specifically dedicated to social innovation. Okay, so you make a kind of tender, it's a kind of bid competition, if you want. So you put, I don't know, 1 million Swiss francs, for instance, on the table from the city of Geneva, and you organize a tender, or you organize an examination, and only the good or the best projects get financed for 1 or 2 years. But after that, they need further and sustainable financing. And in this case of those lunch in the community, the local group of social workers applied to the local authority, to the municipality of Geneva, for regular funding. But when it came to the appropriate commission, the evaluation was very positive, everything was nice, but everybody said, oh, okay, so this is a very good innovation. It works very well, and people like it, and people feel well going to these small neighborhood restaurants. So this is a nice service. We have to generalize it over the whole territory of the city of Geneva. But then, of course, they assessed the costs of the generalization of this social innovation, and the costs were considered as much too high for the social budget of the city of Geneva. And it was the end of the story after 2 or 3 years, something like that. So you see how this process of institutionalization of, in this case of normalization, can be something really tricky and really harmful for social innovation and for the dynamics that had been created in the first place. Okay. What we saw in general terms, as well in the other case studies, in the other countries as well in Scotland, is that in most cases this libertarian thinking, so this democratic content, it was normally rather difficult to generalize, because it was related at some point to more costs and to more complex institutional arrangements with various, associations, public instances, private actors. For instance, in the case of Geneva, you have to cooperate as well with private restaurants of the neighborhood, and those are coordination costs, of course, and in many occasions it was rather difficult to sustain, to make those social innovations sustainable. But we were not completely, or we were not at all, I would say, even not at all negative about about this form and about these dynamics, these processes of social innovation, because we have as well noticed and analyzed how these new connections, you remember the definition by the European Union, creating, how do they phrase it, creating new social relations or new social ties, create new social relationships, yeah. So the idea that those new social relationships, that the network of actors working together for long-term care, once they get connected, even for instance in the case of the care conference, in the case of Hamburg, I said it's rather a negative development because it was controlled by traditional public actors, but still the fact that private actors, associations, the public hand, general practitioners, the hospital, etc., were met together in the context of the care conference. Those are positive effects in terms of networks, in terms of how can we better, for instance, coordinate the way people get discharged from the hospital. We have here procedures, maybe they are too complex. We should talk about that. We should meet in another context. We should. So this is really the idea of improving a network and making a network work. And I think this was a side effect of this care conference, of this instrument of care conference. So in the end of the day, the participatory dimension had an effect. Okay, maybe not the expected effect of bottom-up participation, of an empowerment dimension of this thing, but in the end of the day, a policy effect in terms of networking, etc., etc., better coordination, better trust amongst actors than mistrust. If you remember the table by Bode yesterday or in the last course, organized welfare mix, disorganized welfare mix, connivance on one hand, and competition, mistrust on the other hand, short-term relations, etc. This kind of initiative, so social innovation-based initiatives, can foster trust and network relations amongst actors that have become anyway more market-like, more private, more diversified. And I think that long-term care regulation needs this kind of instruments that would create a kind of community where people know each other, where they can cooperate and where they can confront their ideas as well, and realize that in many occasions it's not because they are private and public and associative and Muslim or Catholic or what do I know, but they cannot work together, or that they cannot exchange over best practices, over networking, etc., etc. So maybe it's a little, it seems to be too positive view over these things, but I tried to provide you an idea of differentiated views with the shortcomings and the pitfalls and the failures of the social innovation, but on the other hand, not to stay positive, but to promote as well and to draw as well from that the positive content. So I mean, we are almost at the end. If we go back to our defining criteria in terms of service, then we have this tension between the service and the organization of a process. So we have this dimension that there's newness in that, okay? So the new character of a service. So for instance, in the case of Geneva, we now know that the quality of the meal is in fact more the social character of the meal rather than the nutrition, really. What kind of calories and how much vegetables and how much. No, the more important thing is really the social dimension, so that people don't get alone. So it's a new knowledge, let's say. So we can transform it into an innovation, something concrete. Okay. So we can meet unmet needs. I think this is okay. For instance, for the case of Geneva, this works. Political content information, yes. There's a lot of inspiration of social innovation. And then the organization, yes, there's an output and a process in that. So this is the differentiation between service and organization. And it produces an effect on the work processes, on the social relations between the actors. I think it works as well, and it's a learning process. I think both dimensions hold true, and I think we can confirm, or we can validate in the end of the day, reaffirm the mechanisms that we expected from social innovation. We have checked for them, and we can confirm the fact that they matter and that they work at some point, even if there are obstacles, and there are obstacles, and there are factors that would hinder, that would create barriers to the realization of the initial intentions of the actors. So from the initial intentions of the actors to the realization, there might be a lot of difference. Not all the initial goals are met in the end of the day, but there's a big deal of positive effect of the whole process of social innovation. I don't want to make this too long. I know I have spoken over 1 hour and 50 minutes now, 55 minutes if I think that the first was over 1 hour, so I think I should stop there. But I think it'd be nice for you to think in terms of what are the connections, what are the relations between the policy innovation and the idea of policy innovation, the contents, the mechanisms that matter, the dimensions of policy innovation that matter in the context of the policy cycle. So I haven't the time now, but there will be plenty of time. I will put on the e-learning platform a kind of analytical grid, and I would like you, as an exercise for the last session, to think of a social innovation that you can find on the internet. You don't have to do a research on that. Of course, you don't have the time, but if you find a nice innovation, either in Italy or in foreign countries, or if you look in the databases of the European Union, that you find social policy innovations in the domain of social policy, and that I would like you to apply this analytical grid. And exactly, so this is something that I will formalize, and I will propose you a small assignment that I will put on the internet. Okay, so that was it. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed the course. And anyway, we are going to meet now in a much more interactive way on the WebEx platform, and it will start because I finished this recording. We are Friday 24th at 3 and 15 minutes, and we should meet at 3:30. So for me, it's really in 15 minutes that we are going to be on WebEx. I hope you are all well. Stay well. Take care of yourselves and your family, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.